mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Thank you for your ears and your time tonight here on Sirius XM's Patriot Channel. Bringing to you right now, Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President at the National Taxpayers Union. Brandon, thank you for coming on.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
I'm glad you're here. So we have the IRS commissioner. They've offered up a choice, and Biden, he's not doing us any favors again.
No, I don't think so. We had an interesting hearing today at the Senate Finance Committee. Danny Werfel is the nominee of President Biden to be the next IRS commissioner. And I was really hoping that he would drill down on some of the problems that are taking place at the IRS, whether it's the customer service issues with them taking, forever to respond to people. Only 1 in 10 taxpayers actually getting through to the IRS when they have a question, let alone some of the corruption. We had the ProPublica leak. We had the targeting of conservative groups back in 2013. We have just a host of problems. And then we have the $80 billion that they're just getting as an infusion of cash to supersize the agency. I was really hoping to get some more positive answers, maybe foolishly hoping for some positive answers from this commissioner. But he was somewhat evasive. He was very polished in that he did not really give a lot of substance to the senators who are asking him questions, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, so he did say, or has said, I suppose, that he will not increase audits on taxpayers who make more than $400,000. But that's hardly a comfort.
Yeah, I'm glad he said that. And Secretary Yellen has made that point as well. But it's not part of statute. It is just what the IRS commissioner, his predecessor, and the Treasury Secretary say. So Republicans, during the course of the debate over this law last year, they offered an amendment to say, let's put that in statute, that we're not going to go after taxpayers, whether they're small businesses or families that are making less than $400,000. And Democrats shot it down. So a senator asked, will you support legislation to make that part of statute, to bind the IRS into a place where they're not going to be targeting working-class Americans? And he basically demurred. He basically said he was not going to take a position or opine on legislation, which was a little bit concerning to hear.
Yeah, it was kind of concerning to hear. So what else should we be concerned with this pick by Biden?
Well, one of the issues I think is going to be really front and center is the 1099-K issue. And Stacy, I'm sure you're familiar with this, as are your listeners. This is the requirement that people are using Venmo or PayPal or other third-party platforms such as Ticketmaster to sell tickets to folks. Any number of other platforms, StubHub. Once you hit a $600 threshold, that company has to report you to the IRS. They have to send you a form. They have to send the IRS a form saying this is how much you did in the way of transactions. This is going to create mass confusion. And that confusion was supposed to happen starting in January of this year. The IRS said, we're going to delay this rule for 1 year, but it's still a mess. It's a slow-moving train wreck. And I would have liked this soon-to-be commissioner to say, I'm going to step in and do something about this to make sure that average Americans are not going to get this confusing paperwork. They're not going to think that they have a larger tax liability than they actually have. And once again, he basically gave non-answers in that space and didn't really commit to anything with a level of strength that I would like to see.
Arg. So this is one of those ones where we don't have great options, right? The IRS, come on, man, that's the scary one, right? We make jokes about the EPA and Department of Education, but we make many jokes about the IRS.
Yeah. The IRS, that's one of the agencies that we have the most direct interaction with, and it's usually not a pleasant form of interaction. A lot of times it's, whether it's filing your tax return, whether it's answering questions subsequently if you made a mistake or if the IRS thinks you made a mistake. The threat of audits obviously hangs over our heads, and it's a huge level of stress for many Americans and small businesses. So we need simplification, of course, in the tax code. We've taken a couple steps in that direction, but taxes need to be easier to fill out. We need to make sure that if we do our due diligence, that we are not going to have audits. We're not going to have harassment from the IRS. And it's not just audits. A lot of times when they're in this revenue maximizing mode that the IRS gets in and is currently in, they're just trying to squeeze as many nickels out of every taxpayer as they can. So if they see anything in your computer software that says you may have made a mistake, they'll just send out a letter and say, hey, we think you may owe an additional $100, $500, whatever that number is. And most people, the wealthy people, big corporations will fight those, but most people don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the resources, the time to fight the IRS. A lot of times people just pay, even if they don't actually owe the IRS any additional money. Just the threat of the IRS sending that letter is enough for people to send more than they actually owe. So
people send in the extra money. Actually, I've done that. They said I miscalculated and I owed $213. And so I quickly sent it in because I thought if I hurry up and send it in, by the time my letter crosses the mail with theirs, they'll say you owe the $213 plus you owe, $45 in penalty because you owed it since this date. And so I hurried up and sent it in. I didn't even look to see what, I just was like, $213, ripped off the piece of paper, wrote the check, mailed it in as fast as I could. Now you don't even have to do that. You can go online and pay as fast as you can. Like you can literally pay.
Yeah. And that's what most people do. Most people don't have the time. They don't have an attorney to jump in and scrutinize whether you're right, whether the IRS is right. They're on their own, and we're juggling work, we're juggling our families, we're juggling all sorts of other things in our lives. So it's easier for a lot of people just to say, all right, here's an extra $150. I just want to be done with this potential headache. And sometimes that money is actually owed, but a lot of times it's not. A lot of times it's just the IRS. Something gets triggered in their software. They get a red flag for your return. And that's really unfortunate. And I think the same is true of this 1099-K form. I'm glad that the IRS paused it for a year. I'd like to see the threshold move back to a level where it's not affecting working class Americans who are just doing a few minor transactions on Venmo here and there. Because a lot of people are going to get this form and they're going to say, oh, this must be taxable income. It's not necessarily taxable income. For instance, you sold a car and you sold that car at a loss, or you sold some old textbooks that were in your basement and you sold those at a loss. That's not taxable income. In most instances, I'm not trying to give your listeners tax advice, of course. That's typically not taxable income, but you may still get this form. You may assume that it's taxable income, so you may put it on your 1040 as such, pay taxes on that amount, even though you didn't owe any extra amount of taxes. And that is extremely concerning. And again, I think the IRS Commissioner, Danny Werfel, the pending IRS Commissioner, should have stepped up and said, we are not going to allow this to take place. We're going to work with Congress to find a solution that does not go after working class Americans.
Yeah. So when you talk about that extra, I've already been 1099-K notified by one organization. They noted that while I met the threshold for the 600, they're using the previous year's threshold, which was 22,000. I didn't come close to meeting that. So they're not going to send me a 1099-K. But that I should be aware that the amount that I did earn there could be taxable and should possibly be reported, and to consult with my tax advisor on to how, whether or not that should be blah, 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 if it was taxable income or not. So they sent that notice out, and I got that notice from two other places, basically saying, the 1099-K requirement has been suspended for a year, but you still might need to report some income that you made here, which is fascinating.
Right. It is fascinating, and you're obviously a very intelligent person, and I'm sure you're able to make sense of it. There's a lot of people, not that they're not intelligent, but are just burdened with their work, with their families, with other things in life this is just going to add a lot of confusion to the process. And I can tell you, I got a request from Ticketmaster earlier in 2022 saying, even though I didn't meet the $600 threshold, that I needed to fill out additional paperwork, including my Social Security number. They sent me an email requesting that information because I'd sold about $200 worth of concert tickets. And I did my due diligence to make sure that was a legitimate email before I provided my Social Security number. But this just creates a huge opportunity for ne'er-do-wells to create similar emails, to blast those off en masse. And a lot of confused people will provide their Social Security number and could be victims of identity theft as a result, let alone the treasure troves of personal data that Venmo and PayPal and now all sorts of other, I mentioned StubHub and Ticketmaster, all of these different third-party transaction websites are going to have more information about you than they ought to have. And that makes them the target for hackers and all sorts of people that want to get that information and abuse it. So there's huge, huge threats that go well beyond just the narrow context of the IRS and your tax liability that could be affecting people if this rule is not changed in a meaningful way.
I mean, you just can't make it up. It's so unfair because we have gotten used to the current system, and this change is wholly unnecessary unless you're overspending, right? It's the same as someone who goes out and buys way too much stuff, and then they try to figure out what of it they can refund because, now they have regret, and some of it's non-refundable. So then they go into these big, arguments. They're going to file a Better Business Bureau complaint because they want to, refund something that clearly was marked final sale or non-refundable. So they go back and forth over that. And the real issue is they overspent and now they need the money back. This is like the equivalent of that, only on a massive weapons grade scale. And it's the federal government, and they're clawing around looking for money because they're spending like drunken sailors, and they're putting it all on us. Like all of us who were literally, everybody has more than one job. That's the other thing, Brandon. I don't know anybody. Well, okay, I do know a few people who have one job. But that doesn't mean they don't have investments or something else that they're using to try to, basically shore up their financial position. Everybody's doing something on the side. So everybody's doing that because everything's expensive, inflation, and also we have to fund all this nonsense.
Yeah. And, the Congressional Budget Office just put out a report today. I don't know if you saw it or not, that the federal government's finances are even worse than we realized. The deficit this year, that's the difference between how much they're taking in and how much they're spending. We thought it was going to be $1 trillion, which is massive. It turns out it's $1.4 trillion. So $400 billion in extra spending, more than what we anticipated. And we're looking at averages of deficits at about $2 trillion for the next 10 years. These have all these numbers have increased. And the largest reason that they've increased is not because of the economic conditions, though that has been a factor. It's because we've spent too much money. And, we can point our fingers at Joe Biden. He deserves a huge, huge portion of the blame. But Congress at large, whether it's Republicans and Democrats, have been spending too much money and not been finding ways to trim wasteful, fraudulent, abusive practices that have taken place, not had the courage to make those kinds of changes. Hopefully we're going to see during this debt ceiling debate some sort of course correction there, because we are on an unsustainable fiscal path right now.
Yep. Whenever you see the government flunkies flailing around looking for ways to extract more cash from you, we should all be very concerned. They're not supposed to act like that. They're supposed to be spending well within their means because none of the money they're spending belongs to them. We're so grateful for your analysis here, and thank you for joining us tonight on this.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right. Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President at the National Taxpayers Union. It's at NTU on Twitter. Such good information. All right. We will be back. We'll talk to the best callers in Sirius XM land. 866-957-2874.